Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going and one day be supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series, such as the 7-part series on Poland's 11th century, as well as complimentary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that, just didn't quite make it into the public show, such as the series called Context of a Conquest, in which we learn about various goings-on happening in the background of William the Conqueror's conquest of England. We're currently enjoying a series called The Book of Alexius that has already shown the rise of Alexius Komnenos and will be updated with the bits of his story that don't affect the main storyline of our public show. If you support what's happening here and want to hear more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. Now, on this episode, we take a look at the real reasons why Robert Guiscard set his sights on invading Eastern Rome. Was he within his rights to push for the imperial crown? Or was it all just another clever gamble on his part? Either way, he acts, and we will take a look at the beginnings of the whole invasion. This is episode 134, entitled The Fall of Corfu. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Robert Guiscard, when we last left him, was preparing for war. A man entered his court in late 1080 claiming to be the deposed Eastern Roman Emperor Michael VII Ducas, and he was seeking Guiscard's help in regaining his throne. But this was a very, very weak pretense for war. We know that Guiscard had always had his eye on bigger and better things than Apulia and Calabria. In fact, it was this that drove him into Sicily. That and the Pope's blessing, of course. From there, he slowly chewed away at smaller Norman and Lombard provinces in southern Italy until all but Naples and Abruzzi held out. And he almost got those by 1080. No, helping the deposed emperor back to the throne of an empire seated over 600 miles, that is, over 1,000 kilometers, away from Bari. This was not a reason to wage an invasion. But this man, this supposed Michael VII, wasn't the only reason for Guiscard's crosshairs to fall onto Constantinople. If you remember, back in the early 1070s, he had landed a major agreement between himself and the Eastern Roman Empire. He had negotiated a betrothal between his own daughter, renamed Helena by the Byzantines when she arrived there, and Emperor Michael VII's son, Constantine Ducas, the heir to the throne of Constantinople. There isn't a good way to express how important this was to Robert Guiscard. This was huge, and he went on expanding throughout the 1070s, as we know. He was absolutely riding high on the idea that his own grandson could be emperor of the most prestigious empire in Europe at the time. His grandson would be the next Roman emperor. Well, when in 1078 Nicephorus III Botaniates deposed Michael VII and sent him, tonsured, to a monastery, Guiscard's daughter had already been sent to Constantinople to learn the culture, the politics, and the Greek language of her new people. This was unsteady territory for Guiscard and his daughter, but Nicephorus III honored Constantine Ducas's right to the throne when he married Constantine's mother, Empress Maria. So far, so good, as far as the betrothal was concerned. However, in 1080, Nicephorus III kicked the boy aside and chose his own kinsman, a man named Sideninos, to be his new heir. This, as we know, kicked off a whole string of events that led to, in 1081, General Alexius Komnenos taking the throne and becoming Emperor Alexius I. Robert Guiscard, in one of his famous tirades, was livid beyond belief. Not only was his daughter, Helena, cast aside as a future empress, but she was being detained in a Byzantine nunnery and not allowed to come home. Now, to be sure, Guiscard wasn't angry out of some, fatherly love for his sweet baby girl. Rather, in addition to missing out on the throne of Eastern Rome, he was also angry because he was being deprived of his daughter, who could be negotiated into another betrothal with a nobleman around the continent. It was all about connections in those days. In early 1081, Guiscard, unaware of what was happening in Constantinople, sent an envoy, a man named Count Radolf of Pontois, to Constantinople in order to officially protest to Emperor Nicephorus III about what he'd done. Guiscard, of course, felt that the betrothal should still be honored and that Constantine Duca should remain Nicephorus III's heir. However, when Count Radolf arrived in mid-April of 1081, he found the entire situation had shifted dramatically. John Carr, in his book, The Komneni Dynasty, writes, quote, Radolf returned with sobering news that he had seen the real Michael VII living in a monastic retirement, exposing the charade by the monk. Bataniates had been sent packing, and that Alexius Komnenos was on the throne. End quote. The entire enterprise of Robert Guiscard's, the whole business of developing a massive navy and pulling together all of his liegemen and vassals in order to launch an attack across the Balkans and on the capital itself, it was all based on a lie, argued Count Radolf. As Carr says, quote-unquote, the Normans' casus belli had evaporated. Alexius Komnenos wasn't at fault for what had happened to Constantine Ducas's betrothal and succession. Count Radolf argued against war, against Eastern Rome. But see, once Robert Guiscard was convinced of something, in this case, even something as outlandish as the throne of Eastern Rome should be in a Hauteville's possession, there was very, very little that could convince him otherwise. Guiscard had created an army and a navy, and by God, he was going to use them. Carr writes, quote, such was his rage and that of the Michael impersonator, that Count Radolf was lucky to escape with his life. He fled for refuge with Bohemond at Brindisi. End quote. So Guiscard's entire pretext for war against Eastern Rome was based on an impersonator and a lie. On the surface, it seems so. But Georgios Theotokos, in his book Bohemond of Taranto, Crusader and Conqueror, suggests that over the last 900 years, historians have come to three deeper reasons why Guiscard would wage war out of nowhere on Eastern Rome. The first one is, as he says, quote, Guiscard would have wished to punish the empire for harboring and providing aid to Norman aristocrats in Apulia who opposed Robert's rule, end quote. Now, this one's a little shallow, but at the time it certainly wasn't. See, we are well aware that Guiscard had a hell of a time trying to keep his nobility in Apulia happy and quiet. After so many uprisings, each one a failure for the noblemen, many of them fled to Constantinople for help. Remember, Apulia was still largely Greek-speaking, right? Just like Calabria was. So Constantinople seemed to be a safe place to go, at least for culture and language. This actually included his nephews, born to Humphrey de Hauteville, Abelard and Herman, if you remember, but they were only the most high profile, which is why they get the airplay for it. But make no mistake, there were others who fled. The second reason, Theotokos states, is, quote, as the Norman expansion in Italy was stagnating, Robert's power, which rested on his ability to hand out booty and land to his vassal lords, would have been threatened. Hence, the opening of another theater of war in the Balkans presented a lucrative option in an operation that parallels to the Norman invasion in England in 1066. End quote. This one I would have preferred for him to have saved until the last reason, as it serves as by far, at least in my opinion, the most reasonable reason for Guiscard's invasion of the Balkans. See, it's no secret that wealth wasn't the key to longevity and influence in the Middle Ages. Land was the key. It's a lesson we will see on full display with the future King Henry I of England, but that's a story for another time. Land was key, not cash, not treasures. Guiscard was actually aware of this, and our evidence has been there all along when we see him, time and time again, give his money and his treasures away freely, but the land he was quite stingy with. It's the whole reason why a young Roger de Hauteville, now Grand Count, or Great Count of Sicily, Roger, chose to focus on Sicily and not Calabria. Calabria was already taken. Sicily was ripe for the pickings. If you ask me, a mere student of history and not an official historian, I'd choose this one, the desire for more land to appease his vassals, as the most believable reason for Guiscard to continue with the invasion even after Count Radolf had basically said this was an impersonator of Michael VII. And finally, the third reason that Theotokos gives us has to do with his illegitimate son, Mark de Hauteville, better known as Bohemond. Guiscard truly cared for Bohemond. Bohemond, as we'll see, was a chip off the old block, you could say. I mean, the man was quite literally Robert Guiscard 2.0, a new and improved version, you could say. Theotokos writes that establishing, quote, a Norman principality for Bohemond on the opposite side of the Adriatic would certainly have looked like an enticing plan in the 1070s, end quote. This one kind of speaks for itself, but think about it. Guiscard couldn't name Bohemond any sort of successor to his Apulian and Calabrian and Sicilian realms without upsetting the firmly accepted practice of primogeniture, the very same system that drove tens of thousands of Norman boys out of Normandy in the first place. Sure, Bohemond was Guiscard's firstborn, but by remarrying, he cast aside Bohemond as his heir by default. His firstborn with his second wife, Sikelgaita, named Roger Borsa, well, this was now his one true heir. So, what was left for Bohemond? Apulia and Calabria were Roger Borsa's. While there was absolutely no reason to upset the flow of things in Sicily under his brother, Great Count Roger, Bohemond was left with nothing at that point. Acquiring a brand new principality elsewhere would alleviate the fears of taking away from Roger Borsa. This was also a strong possibility for the reason for Guiscard's invasion of the Balkans. And it kind of piggybacks on the second one mentioned as well. What I hope to accomplish here is to provide alternative and, in my opinion, far more believable reasons that Guiscard continued with his attack on Eastern Rome. It wasn't necessary. Eastern Rome, especially under Alexius I, had no quarrel and wanted no quarrel from the Normans in South Italy. Was it all about the supposed Michael VII impersonator seeking to regain his crown with Norman help? Absolutely not. In fact, it was merely a clever ruse, if you ask me. Well, not terribly clever, as it fell apart upon the return of Count Radolf of Pontoise, but it offered a convenient excuse. Was it all about his daughter Helena? Well, Guiscard was 100% miffed about the way Nicephorus III promised to honor the betrothal and succession, but then unceremoniously threw it out, including his daughter. But that was the game in those days, so it couldn't have been completely out of Guiscard's mind, even when he agreed to the terms in the first place. Was it all about how Eastern Rome harbored Guiscard's rebellious nephews and other Apulian vassals? Nah, that just doesn't hold any water, at least in terms of launching a whole invasion. Sure, he didn't like it, for sure, but to attack Eastern Rome for it? No way. To me, though, all of these provided subtext for the second one, the one about him needing more land with which to keep his restless, power-hungry, and land-hungry vassals at bay. It was far more believable as the main reason for the invasion. And the third one, the one about providing Bohemond a state of his own, could very well have been a lovely afterthought for a proud father of a son he could do very little to officially honor. But I say, they all played into his decision to move forward even after the news about Alexius I being the new emperor and Michael VII was actually witnessed in a monastery way out east and not sitting in Guiscard's court. Deception was Guiscard's bread and butter. I mean, the very nickname, just as a reminder, the very nickname Guiscard that he proudly owned and been known as at the time for around 3 decades now, meant the crafty or the wily or even the fox. So I'm glad we had some actual reasons laid out instead of just going by the traditional story that Guiscard moved against Eastern Rome because some random guy dressed up like a monk and played himself off as the former emperor. But let's get to the fun stuff now, the actual invasion. So, setting the scene here. By April of 1081, around the time that Alexius Komnenos put on the crown in Constantinople, Robert Guiscard was well on his way to building the necessary ships needed to carry his largest army to date. To be clear, he didn't care who served in this army. He needed warm bodies. That's what he needed. He needed numbers. It was a long way across the Balkans, and he knew the Balkans were already Balkanized, see what I did there, into rebellious groups such as the Bulgarians, the Pechenegs, the various Greek communities, and those who lived in the modern states of Albania and former Yugoslavia. The kingdom of Dukla was right smack in the middle of his path to Constantinople too, or at least the southern part of it. There is a long history of the Balkans being the reason we, in English, have the word Balkanize, which means to divide into small, hostile regions. Numbers was the name of the game. Cleverness was secondary. Guiscard, after his brush with death a handful of years earlier, already had a recognized heir in his son Roger Borsa after Sikelgaita drew all of his major nobility together and forced them to support Roger. But Guiscard felt that a renewal of loyalties toward his chosen heir was necessary, as this might be the most dangerous adventure to date. He officially declared Roger Borsa, 21 years old as of 1081, as the heir to his entire dukedom, which, to be clear, consisted of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily. And while Guiscard was away, Roger Borsa would act as interim duke. This freed Guiscard up to travel to the southern Apulian port city of Otranto and personally oversee the work being done to build his army and navy. Again, this was April of 1081. As for the army itself, well, this is where things get a little tricky. Medieval chroniclers were driven by bias and exaggeration, so you can't really believe the numbers they tell you. You can only guess as to which ones were the closest based on myriad other factors. Anna Komnene writes of 30,000 troops, while Malaterra reports 1,300 knights and non-knights that were really, quote-unquote, a poorly armed mob. In fact, I'm far more inclined to believe Malaterra simply based on the fact that Anna Komnene did everything she could to make her father sound more heroic. Again, it was the name of the game in chronicling back then. Actually, it's not too far off to our media today, is it? Malaterra also states, quote, "Those who were present during this affair have testified that he had with him no more than 1,300 fully armed knights." End quote. But not everyone was confident with Guiscard's dreams of grandeur. Malaterra tells us, quote, "Some of those knights who were traveling with him were so dreadfully beset by apprehension of what the enterprise might bring that they trembled abjectly, as though they were afflicted by some sort of fever." End quote. Another chronicler, William of Apulia, wrote, quote, "It seemed to many that this expedition was an unfair and burdensome matter, and in particular those who had wives and much-loved children at home were reluctant to fight such a war." End quote. But Guiscard was Guiscard, and according to Malaterra, quote, "He maintained an air of confidence which raised the spirits of his men, whom fear had rendered downcast." He encouraged them through gifts and by making promises that they would in the future gain both property and treasure if he did successfully conquer that land, provided that they chose to act boldly with him. End quote. But what choice did they really have? Guiscard had set his mind to something, and feudal obligations were such that, short of yet another rebellion destined to fail, they needed to show up for their liege lord. Bold or not, they assembled. It was then, in early May, that Georgios Palaiologos arrived in Durazzo on the Adriatic coast opposite Apulia. But Anna reports that the moment Palaiologos arrives, the current leader of Durazzo, a man named Monomachos, defected, not to Robert, as Alexios had once feared, but to Constantine Bodin, king of Dukla, which was a papacy-recognized kingdom of Serbs. Constantine Bodin was the king of a separate state who recently rebelled against Eastern Rome and even adopted Catholic Mass, but he was still friendly with Constantinople. Friendly enough, anyway. With the defection of Monomachos, Palaiologos sent word to Alexios to keep him abreast of the situation. Alexios, though a little miffed at being snubbed by Monomachos before his rebellion, had moved on from the slight and actually sent Monomachos a letter of safe passage, and Monomachos duly returned to the Byzantine fold. In the meantime, Palaiologos knew what to do to the city of Durazzo. There was no question that Guiscard would attack, and he knew he had no time to lose. Anna writes, quote, Georgios Palaiologos was a brave man. Thoroughly trained in the art of leadership, he had fought on 1,000 battlefields in the east and proved victorious. Now, without alarm, he proceeded to fortify the town. The battlements were constructed according to the emperor's advice. Catapults were set up everywhere on the walls. The demoralized soldiers were encouraged with scouts posted all along the ramparts. Georgios himself, moreover, visited them at all hours of day and night, exhorting the sentinels to be extra watchful. End quote. Now, another detail we're given is that Georgios Palaiologos ordered the majority of the wooden planks that made up the walls to be left unnailed. In Anna's words, quote, so that if the Latins did climb up on ladders, as soon as they set foot on the planks, they would upset them and crash down to the ground, plank and all. End quote. This was accompanied by numerous letters sent by Palaiologos on behalf of Emperor Alexius I to all the communities in the region to fortify themselves, to gain their arms, to promise them the safety provided by an army, but to be ready to act in defense if necessary, to remain ever vigilant. Back in Otranto, Robert decided to move to Brindisi in order to check things out there. Otranto was still the Adriatic port that he would launch the attack from. When he arrived in Brindisi, he learned of the well-known general, that is, Georgios Palaiologos, having taken control of Durazzo and the orders to fortify the city there. So Guiscard ordered siege engines and towers to be built in Brindisi. Once the ships arrived from Otranto, they would load them up on the ships then, so once they made the trip across the Adriatic, they would already be ready to use. In mid-May of 1081, while the siege engines were constructed and moved to Otranto, where the ships were, the armies assembling their last few stragglers and the plans being finalized for the invasion, Robert Guiscard ordered his son, Bohemond, now 27 years old, to assemble a much smaller force and head across in front of the larger fleet. John Julius Norwich, in his book, The Other Conquest, described Bohemond like this, quote, he was cast in his father's mold, with broad shoulders surmounting an immense barrel chest, a fresh complexion, and thick fair hair, which he kept close cropped, after the fashion of the younger generation of his compatriots. The most striking thing about him, however, was his enormous height, which a slight stoop did nothing to conceal. And when Robert was not around, Bohemond seemed to tower above all the other knights and their associates. End quote. And here's a small detail. When he says fair hair, thick fair hair, that is to say back then, red hair. So Bohemond was a ginger. Keep that in mind. Anna Komnene, on the other hand, had absolutely no love for Bohemond for reasons that went far beyond this particular invasion. Bohemond will be a thorn in Alexius Komnenos' side for a number of decades after this adventure, but, as always, Anna gives the devil his due. She describes Bohemond like this, quote, Bohemond resembled his father in all respects, in daring, strength, bravery, and indomitable spirit. In short, he was the exact replica and living image of his father. He was sent with a powerful force to our country, with the aim of ravaging the areas around Avlona. He at once attacked Canina, Hyrico, and Avlona like a streaking thunderbolt, with threats and an irrepressible fury. He seized them, and fighting on, ravaged the surrounding areas and set them to fire. End quote. So she laid out a little history, and even somewhat complimented the man, but she also got her digs in as well. She wrote about him, quote, Bohemond was in fact like the acrid smoke which precedes a fire, the preliminary skirmish which comes before the great assault. Father and son you might liken to caterpillars and locusts, for what was left by Robert, his son fed on and devoured. End quote. Told you, no love lost between Anna Komnene and Bohemond. Now, Bohemond was able to take these towns with only 15 ships, which amounted to around 2,000 soldiers and their horses. Those smaller towns of Hyrico, Canina, and Avlona were strategically important, but the island of Corfu was the real prize. In fact, Corfu was the initial linchpin behind the entire invasion. Corfu was an island strategically located right at the opening of the Adriatic Sea. And if Robert Guiscard could control it, while also controlling the heel of the boot, well, that would mean the entire Adriatic would be controlled by Normans. This alerted the Venetians, who relied on the Adriatic being split between their friends the Byzantines and their not so friendly Normans.
This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
This split put to rest any chance of one side demanding more of them than what they were willing to provide. Unbeknownst to both Robert Guiscard and Alexius I, the Venetians had in fact caught wind of this invasion and were currently bolstering their naval fleet. Either way, once Bohemond scouted out the island and the city of the same name, Corfu, he decided to wait on Dad with the rest of the army and navy. Theotokos writes, quote, Corfu's fortifications must have been considerable, and the castles well fortified and maintained. Hence Bohemond would have appreciated that his advance party was completely ill-equipped for such an undertaking. End quote. While Bohemond waited in the port of Butrinto, Guiscard, now in late May, set sail across the Adriatic Sea. Guiscard landed in Avlona, also, by the way, also called Valona for clarity's sake. So you'll see Avlona and Valona in the records as well as maps. Same place, though. And he picked up some Ragusan vessels full of Ragusan soldiers. John Julius Norwich, in, again, his book, The Other Conquest, states, quote, the Ragusans, like so many other Balkan peoples, were always glad of the opportunity for a crack at the Byzantines, end quote. Guiscard then moved straight toward Corfu, having heard word that Bohemond decided to stand down instead of conducting a foolhardy attack against it. And as he approached Corfu, Guiscard laid out a siege plan and immediately worked his way around the island. Now, initially, he hit the capital of the island, again, the city Corfu, but realized he would need to secure his surroundings first. He set up a siege outside the fortress of Cassiope, a town on the northeast corner of the island of Corfu that controlled the narrow strait between the island and the mainland, where his son was currently stationed. There is absolutely no details of how, at this point, Guiscard conquered the island itself. The only thing we're sure of is that the Corfiots abruptly surrendered without bloodshed upon seeing Guiscard's forces ready to lay siege. Corfu should have already been taken care of by Bohemond, bloodshed or not, but Guiscard wasn't inconvenienced by this, by Bohemond's decision to stand down. In fact, when he arrived and took control of Corfu, he was immediately ready to keep moving northward. Corfu was only the insurance necessary for the connection across the sea, a connection with home and its resources that every invading nation needed. The real prize, as we know, was Durazzo. Durazzo had one key distinction. It was the westernmost edge of the nearly 900-year-old Via Egnatia that led straight to Constantinople. Guiscard needed Durazzo first and foremost. Guiscard made for Avlona, where Bohemond was currently running raids in the surrounding areas, terrorizing the people and gathering supplies, much like Anna had told us that he did. The acrid smoke that was Bohemond had arrived, and now the raging fire that was Robert Guiscard was in control of the opening of the Adriatic Sea, the strategically vital island of Corfu, and a few fortress towns up the coast toward Durazzo. By early June 1081, everything was coming up Guiscard. It couldn't have gotten off to a better start, but the beginning of this invasion was not even finished yet. Durazzo, again, was the prize. The capture of Durazzo would shift everything into the second phase of the invasion, in which Guiscard would lead his army across the Via Egnatia toward Constantinople. At least that was the plan. But again, Durazzo had to happen before any of that. Phase 1, Step 1, establish control of Corfu. Check. Phase 1, Step 2, conquer Durazzo. Well, that was the plan anyway. And Guiscard's next move toward Durazzo will be the subject of our next episode, and I can't wait to tell you about it.